Good morning, everyone. Good evening for those of you dialing in from the US. We have two cohort companies out of the US and two out of Canada. They're dialing in late. And of course, one of our speakers, Lisa Shea, who will introduce herself in a moment, is also dialing in from the East Coast of the US. So thank you, Lisa, for joining us very late. We have a very exciting topic today. We'll be talking about clinical trial management. We'll talk about hospital pilots as well. And we have an outstanding panel. We have a speaker from Asia Pacific with a great deal of background and experience in running clinical trials in the region. And we have a panelist joining us from the US. We'll get both the US and the APAC perspective on clinical trial management. I'm very fortunate to introduce you, and I'll have them just introduce themselves very briefly. We have Larissa Nagra from Icon Clinical Search. She's based here in Singapore. And we have Lisa Shea from Proxima in the US. My name is Frederick Nabik. I'm the Managing Director for MedTech Innovator based here in Singapore. We have our APAC MedTech Innovator team here as well. And for our cohort companies that are dialing in, I think by now you know the drill. Please queue up your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to your questions at the top of the hour. So thanks again, both Lisa and Larissa, for joining us. And I'll start with Larissa here. Tell us a little bit about your background in clinical trial management and about your company and your role in that company. You're mute, Larissa.
Thank you, Frederick. It's a pleasure to be on this panel today. And great thanks to the MedTech Innovator Asia Pacific Accelerator Program for inviting me for this. I am based in Singapore, and I've been in the industry for the last 29 years and predominantly very much keen on working in the clinical trial space. I started my career from the grassroots level as a CRA, so grown over the years and seen a lot of changes in the industry. And with the pharmacy degree in the pocket, it was a nice space to enter, which gave me the opportunity to work with great leaders in the regulatory space and the clinical space. So I'm basically a clinical research professional from the CRO side and have worked here in Asia Pac for over 30 years. So looking forward to the discussion today.
Thank you so much, Larissa. And Lisa, welcome.
Hi, Frederick. Thank you. Lisa Shea, as Frederick mentioned, I'm on the East Coast of the US. I've been in the clinical research industry for almost 20 years. I also started at the grassroots level as a research assistant at the site side. I spent quite a few years, 14 years at the site, spent a lot of time managing research trials in the hospital setting. And then I came to the CRO world, where I've been about 3 years doing project management in various activities on a variety of different types of clinical trials, global and regional.
Excellent. And Lisa, you've done a fair bit of work in the MedTech arena as well, I understand.
That's correct, yes. A couple device studies as a coordinator, managing those at the site level, and then also project management of a bunch of different device trials, variety of different indications as project manager at the CRO level.
Excellent, excellent. So I wanted to ask you both first, before we dive into the details here, of how your firm typically engages with startups in the MedTech arena, and how it might differ working with a smaller company versus a much larger sponsor. And Larissa, maybe you want to share your views on that first.
Thank you. So as we see the industry moving, there has been predominantly two verticals. One is obviously the large pharma and large, MedTech companies like Medtronic, and these are the ones who have been working in this space for a very, very long time. But we see another very interesting vertical which has come in, which is obviously the startup phase or mid-sized companies. And most of the CROs have realized that these two verticals are very, very distinct in the way they are to be managed. The requirements are very different. The expectations from both the stakeholders, whether it is the sponsor side or the CRO side, the understanding is different. So from ICON's perspective, we have clearly defined two different verticals to manage these different types of organizations. And while working with the smaller biotechs or smaller startup companies, our intention is to understand how they are structured, what are the areas that they need support in. They're experts in their product. They know their product very well. They know what they want to achieve in the long term, whether it's going to be out-licensed or is it going to be taken forward by a partnership deals. They know exactly the strategy, but they may not have the entire resource requirements, or they don't have complete experience in that particular management of clinical research or into clinical development or relationship with KOLs, hospitals, structure, guidelines, regulatory requirements. So wherever there is a kind of a gap, we tend to support them in a very flexible and adaptable manner. So our selection is very straightforward. If it is a startup and a biotech, we have a team which is agile, which has been trained to support such companies and manage their expectations. So, and if it's a large company, we know they have their own infrastructure.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's very helpful, Larissa. And Lisa, how does Proxima work with smaller companies typically, and how does that differ from how you work with larger sponsors?
Well, as a very small company ourselves, it's a nice contrast to Icon and Larissa's experience. Proxima is a very small company. We're very used to working with the very small startups in the MedTech arena, and it allows us a flexibility. It allows us to, as Larissa had said, the companies that we work with, they're experts in their device. They might not be the research experts. So we are, we're nimble enough and we're flexible enough that we can be the research experts and partner very nicely with the companies and the small teams, providing the resources, providing the different infrastructure so that the research can be conducted, and it's conducted in a way that is acceptable, is GCP compliant, and they're the device experts and we're the research experts, and we just kind of fall into step very nicely, being such a small company as well.
Great, thank you. And of course, Proxima has been a long-standing partner of MedTech Innovator in the US, not yet in Asia Pacific, but certainly in the part of our US program. So just I want to talk very briefly about the outsourcing relationship, and maybe let me turn to Larissa first on this. A small startup, obviously, they have limited resources, and they have to weigh what can they do in-house versus what do they want to outsource. Are there specific clinical trial related tasks that you see that can be done relatively easily in-house by a startup company, and what is best outsourced, or would you say that it's easier to just outsource everything that is clinical trial related? Specifically in Asia Pacific, I wanted to ask you if there's any way that a smaller company would be able to run a trial without a CRO.
That's an interesting question, and I think my suggestion and my recommendation is it's the best, because if your funding is limited, obviously as a startup, you have each dollar needs to have the maximum return on investment. You have to be very careful how you spend, especially in the current day market. It's not a very a market where you can just spend money, and VCs and PEs are not really doling out funds so easily. Now they're very very careful in how they assign. So if I had to suggest, and if I had to be a startup, my recommendation would be as follows: simple. Break the task into small pieces. Work with a CRO, engage with them in a consulting capacity. See what is the task, what is the direction the CRO is giving to take the product forward or to take the strategy forward. If you have in-house capabilities and if you have in-house experts, please use them, maximize it. But my advice is, as I see many other startup companies, is it's very important to engage with people who have experience. Try and look forward and see what are the issues that you're going to encounter. Learn from other people's mistakes rather than making a mistake and having to waste money. So if you break the task, there are some things that a startup can do very well, especially when it involves their IP management or how the IP is going to be, how you're collecting data, how do you want to do a strategy with regard to placing the product in the market. But when it comes to some level of engagement with regulators, engagement with sites, selecting KOLs, then I think it is best done by somebody who knows the landscape well, where to go, how to work with those entities, because they are quite complex and they need a lot of pre-work when you go to their offices. For example, regulatory authorities, you cannot go unprepared. You need to have a lot of, pre-work done to go to them. So I would say break into small pieces, engage with the right people, discuss your problem statement, and then decide whether you want to outsource or don't want to outsource.
That's good advice. Thanks, Larissa. And Lisa, your perspective of this, what's your experience from the US and working with smaller companies in the US?
I do agree. I think a lot of what Larissa had said definitely applies to any research activities in the US. Kind of one of the considerations that would be helpful is at what stage, what's the volume that you're looking at? For instance, are you looking at just the pilot study where you might be enrolling just a handful of subjects? Those activities you might be able to more easily manage in-house, like Larissa had said, with the consulting support of a CRO. And then once it expands to the pivotal stage of research, where the CRO has a little bit more bandwidth to manage, the CRA activities, that manage the site management activities, identify and properly select your sites. That might be a little bit more useful to definitely have the CRO more engaged in, rather than just a consulting phase. That said, having that pilot, that expertise in the pilot stage is also going to be really critical, because that's going to be what fuels how you move forward and what you do in your pivotal studies.
Right. Excellent. Thank you. Avoidable mistakes, avoiding pitfalls. Larissa, what are some of the major mistakes that you see smaller companies stumble into as they plan and execute their clinical studies? Very, very briefly, and then we'll go into the details of clinical strategy and so on.
I think sometimes, that's my observation and it's my view, I find a copy and paste mentality, which is, you tend to pick up what somebody else has done, and without applying enough logic, especially in the inclusion-exclusion criteria, using a similar kind of thought process. I think the industry is evolving very fast. The regulations are changing, and we have to be proactive. It is difficult for a young company to move in unknown territory, especially when the regulations are, changing for example, in silico clinical trials are coming in now. You save
we'll come
so
to
much
that actually. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I think that's what is it. Just be more daring to, have a new way of working and try and adapt new regulations would be my advice.
Yeah, that's a good point. Lisa, your thoughts on common pitfalls then, or common mistakes that you see among smaller companies in the US market?
I would say that one of the pitfalls is, if consulting with the research expert at CRO is how, the avenue that's chosen, the CRO is going to be, the experts there are going to have a plethora of recommendations of what to do every step of the way, and also provide a rationale behind those recommendations. I think one of the challenges that's encountered often is almost tunnel vision and not paying much attention to those recommendations, not paying much attention to the rationale. There's multiple choices every step of the way that can be made, and there's risks associated with all those choices. Weighing those risks effectively and understanding the risks and what is accompanied with those decisions is really, really critical.
Very, very helpful. So let's go into clinical strategy here in a little bit more detail, and just for the information for our listeners here, what we've done at the beginning of the MedTech Innovator Accelerator program, we've actually surveyed our cohort companies, and they provided us some questions. So many of these questions actually are questions directly from the companies that are in our 2024 cohort. One question is about how far in advance a startup should engage with a CRO. Some of them are already at a clinical stage. Some of them are still doing preclinical work. And at what point should a startup begin to have that conversation with a CRO and engage with a CRO? How far in advance of wanting to kick off that first trial does it make sense to have a conversation with a CRO? Larissa.
My suggestion would be to start as early as possible. And as I said, you have to do it in bits and pieces.
Yeah.
While you are developing your clinical strategy, your commercial strategy, I would strongly recommend having a conversation. And it doesn't really need to be with a CRO, clinical CRO. It could be also with the regulatory expert,
Yep.
As even Lisa mentioned, some consultants who have experts in this space. But always try and have a conversation and a brainstorming session with experts who are in this space, worked in the space before. So that would be, and it could start anytime, very, very early stages before first in human trials. Also, you can start the conversation. That would be the best way forward. But just as an add-on, if some companies have already moved to the next phase, I would still say it is never late. It's always good to, immediately connect, reach out, and have a conversation, because there's a lot to be done, and it's better to correct it at an early stage than to go further ahead and then have to see that you missed certain key endpoints or key aspects of your strategy, which could have been addressed with a very minor tweak in the way you are managing your studies. So please pick up the phone and have a conversation. And many CROs are, I can tell you from Icon's side, we are very, very collaborative. We do have a session where we talk to our sponsors and are happy to engage with them without any cost as such. It's a early engagement. Just have a conversation. Please do reach out.
That's great advice, because I know that many companies with limited cash in the bank are hesitant sometimes to reach out to a larger CRO or even a smaller CRO, given what costs typically look like when it comes to starting their clinical work. Lisa, I wanted to ask you a slightly different question, and this is from our cohort. How does a CRO typically determine sample size? And how does a CRO typically determine time and cost estimates when it comes to doing early stage trials for a medical device, smaller medical device company?
The sample size, of course, would be determined with the help of a statistician doing the sample size calculations based on all of the considerations, the necessary power, stuff like that. So it is a very in-depth statistical conversation looking at the target number and the rationale behind that sample size calculation. Study design has a lot of impact on that as well. In terms of estimating the costing, of course, there's going to be the element of the number of subjects, the duration of the trial, how, not just how long the trial will be ongoing for, because there's management activities that go on for that period, but also how long are subjects going to be on the trial for. There's a lot of costing differences in the US compared to everywhere else in the world. So there is a little bit of a shock I've noticed when some of our partners come from EU and they're looking at the investigator estimates. There is a little bit of a shock looking at those dollar figures because it is expensive to conduct those trials in the US, but necessary if they're looking for the market in the US. So costing really depends very, very greatly on how long the study will be going on for broadly and then individually for the subjects.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, and we've certainly seen that shock as well from time to time with some of the smaller companies in this part of the world. Lisa, to what extent does the US FDA get involved in advising on sample size for certain types of trials? Do they provide any guidance at all? Is that something that a company can expect to hear back from during a pre-sub meeting with the FDA, or is that solely determined between the CRO and the company?
There would be a discussion of the rationale behind that, yeah. Primarily determined by the statistician, the support of the statistician with the CRO and the company, but there is some comments, because this is going to have an impact on the feasibility of the clinical trial. What is the feasibility of determining the outcomes and proving the hypothesis if you have either low power or a too small sample size, stuff like that. So there would be a comment and a review of that.
Right. Thanks. That's helpful. And Larissa, the Asia Pacific perspective here, how excuse me, how is sample size typically determined? What's the level of engagement with local regulatory authorities? And at what point does it make sense for a company to start to look at multi-country trials, given the heterogeneity of Asia Pacific? Very often companies may want to look at trials that cover multiple countries and multiple ethnic groups. Where does that typically play in? Is that something a company needs to do typically on the advice of a regulatory authority? What's your experience in that area?
So sample size is a very, very, aspect which is basically targeted at the product that you're developing, the endpoint, as Lisa mentioned. You have to have a very strong supporting argument on how you're going to achieve your endpoint. What is the statistically significant, data that is going to be available based on the response that your product are you expecting from your product? So from the regulatory perspective across the globe, any regulator, they would not be really advising on the number of sample size for a clinical trial. It will be based heavily on the way the biostatisticians have defended the sample size that you're proposing in your study based on your preclinical or your early clinical data. I think all the statisticians in the regulatory office are very much aligned to having very good questions being asked. Why did you select this endpoint? What is the significance, and what do you intend to see? So I would say from regulatory perspective, it should be very, very well defended and clearly calculated based on what you want to achieve. Now, the question is, sample size is a very, very critical piece in the cost of running a clinical trial, as Lisa mentioned. And I am seeing sometimes, some of the sponsors have come up with some very high number of patients to be recruited, which does not really require. So I would say investment in a biostatistician or a biostatistical consulting group is of paramount importance. I think this is, I would not emphasize more. You could really build a very strong study with a very few patients if it is designed properly and the collection of sample times are also well managed. So that would be one of the first questions that I think I would answer on what you asked. Now, with regard to your second point on how to run a MRCT in Asia PAC, the countries that are, would be the best selected for, my first advice would be to go to countries which have very strong, well-developed regulatory processes as well as site network. I think these are and I would add KOLs. So the highlight of the countries, as I always, my favorite countries are, all my countries are favorite, but the top ones are Korea, Taiwan. These are the two main markets which I think are very far ahead, in regard to how they look at the regulatory submission package and how they work with the sponsors or with the startup companies to ensure that they are placing the study well in the country. So these would be my top markets at the moment. Australia is also very exciting, interesting market, but very, very busy at the moment, at this point in time, but worth exploring.
That's immensely helpful. And the point there about biostatistician input early on is I think very, very helpful. Larissa, just staying with you for a second, I wanted to ask you, and this is a question we get quite frequently, to what extent clinical evidence generated outside of Asia Pacific, either US or EU, can be used in registering medical devices in APAC, or to what extent there is a need to localize trials and do work, repeat some of that clinical work here in the region?
I'll try to just touch on a very high level, because I'm not really an expert. So there are different medical device, different classifications of medical device. They all have a different requirements. So each product has to be handled in a different manner. Just to answer, there are obviously certain countries like Taiwan, US, Korea, US. They have a kind of an understanding on how the data would be acceptable across both the markets. So my advice again would be just to make sure that check what the regulations are. There are certain studies which accept the data from the other markets and may require some additional, collection of real-world evidence data as they move along without having to go through clinical trial. But that is on case-to-case basis. What is the type of the medical device? I'm not an expert. I would say it's a huge market. It's a huge piece.
Of course,
but again, advise people to talk to the experts. But there are clinical trials that could be, data could be accepted in either markets across the globe.
And I believe that, thanks for that. And I believe there have been some changes among some of the regulatory authorities relatively recently in terms of broadening the acceptance of clinical work done overseas, NMPA in China, for example, and so on. Lisa, to what extent does the US FDA accept data from outside of the US? So the same question, but with the US perspective here. Clinical trial data generated, for example, in Asia Pacific, is that generally accepted by the US FDA, or are there certain are there differences between classes of devices and types of medical devices that where FDA might be a little bit more insistent on having local clinical work done in the US?
Similarly to Larissa, I'm not an expert on all of the different classifications, so the specificity is a little bit lacking here. However, there is a general acceptance of data from outside in APAC, EU, and as with the inclusion of data in the US. So if the target market is going to include the US, data can be completed outside of the US, but it does also have to be, of course, focused with data collected in the US as well. The breakdown of how much will vary depending on the classes of devices and whatnot, just like what Larissa was saying in APAC.
Makes sense. Makes sense. So again, to our cohort companies, do queue up your questions, and we'll get to those as we move into Q&A. We touched briefly about KOLs and clinical site partners, and I think, Larissa, you brought this up earlier, so I'll turn to you maybe for this. Startups, whether I guess particularly in the MedTech arena, very often turn to their sometimes limited KOL network to identify and expand clinical trial sites. What advice do you have to companies in choosing their clinical site partners, and what are some of the challenges potentially there in APAC?
I think that's it's a very interesting and trick question, I must say. But I think it always happens. There are relationships with the startup, that they have with the KOLs, and sometimes you see very flashy KOLs who are very well placed, have a very good following in the industry, so they obviously command a very good place to be selected as one of the investigators. I always say investigators and clinicians never are the same. You have to have a very strong mindset for a person who wants to run clinical trials. So my advice would be, never run into making decisions like they say, oh, this is a KO, a key opinion leader that we're going to have as an advisor or this is going to be the person who is going to be, advising us in a diet. I think I would really suggest to startup to just take a step back. Everybody's a friend, everybody's good, everybody has their, their strengths. There's never a real need to have somebody, just picked up and decided and made announcement on. Watch the scene. There are a lot of dynamics in this industry. A lot of hospitals, investigators have different groups. Don't have to pick up one group to get the other group out. Startups are neutral companies. They can go to any market. Everybody, if you have a good product, KOLs will be keen to work with you. It is all patient driven now. If patients see there's a good product, they would be asking the investigator or the doctor that I have seen this product in the market, I want to use it. So the whole landscape has changed now. It's more driven from patients demanding what kind of treatment they want rather than having the doctor suggesting. There's a shift.
Mm-hmm.
So I would suggest is just to be very calm in selecting the right players that they want to have in the clinical research as they move along. No quick decisions would be the best advice.
That's helpful. Thanks. And Lisa, your perspective on that from the US and working with some of the smaller MedTech companies there. And
very much the same.
Okay.
You see it a lot where there's a selection of, like Larissa was saying, friends, supporters, people who really want, they mean well, of course. They're people who care about patients, they care about you, they care about the device, moving technology forward. However, there is the health of the research study that is at stake, and you really want to focus and have, include your KOLs. Those are, they certainly have their place. However, ensuring that you're also selecting the team members, the sites that have a lot of expertise. Don't have all your KOLs be clinical KOLs and have those be your sole sites. That does pose a risk to the integrity of the trial. So having the limit and focusing on your end game, like Larissa was saying, take a step back. You do have a goal of having this product tested successfully, which does include the input of your KOLs. But keep in mind, to an extent, KOLs are research experts as well. So it might be, we don't often refer to our strong investigators as KOLs, but they're a different kind of KOL if you think about it, right? Because they are experts in that mindset that Larissa had mentioned, which is very, very different than the clinical mindset of treating patients. They have the strong mindset of enrolling patients and managing patients on clinical trials, which is different than the routine clinical care. So having that healthy balance is very, very important for the health of a clinical trial.
Great points, Lisa. Thank you for that. One area related, of course, that is often a source of frustration for smaller companies is the wait for IRB approvals. Larissa, what other ways that one can fast track IRB approvals and in Asia Pacific, what have you seen in that area, and what are some of the best practices to overcome that hurdle?
That's where a CRO can help, because CROs have actually got a very good idea about what the requirements of IRB are. We have already kind of a repository of what kind of questions the IRB will be asking. So we will proactively address and see if the informed consent has all the points added as per the IRB requests. So this is one space that I would highly recommend. Work with a CRO, give them this task, because there's a lot of documentation to be sent. You need to make sure that you are tracking all these documents and meeting the requirements. So if there are certain things that this particular IRB is going to ask, for example, compensation for the patients or a particular language to be included, then it is better that the information is already part of the ICF before the package or the dossier is submitted to the IRB. So efficiencies are basically, all the IRBs meet as per the rooster they have. You can't really, work towards that. They all have certain guidelines, SOPs that they need to follow with regard to review of the proposal. So the only time you can save is if you submit your dossier in completeness to the IRB, and there is a very minimal chance of it coming back with a query. That would be the best, I could advise. So that way, CRO has a very good idea of what the IRBs really need in Asia-Pac.
That makes sense. Thanks. And Lisa, is the situation any different in the US, or other ways that a smaller company could help accelerate IRB approvals?
It's very much the same. I would just expand on what Larissa was saying by, the CROs, we have the expertise and we do this day in and day out. So we know we have a solid site network. We know the turnaround times for IRB approvals, all of those submission expectations. Just like Larissa said, we know what's expected in the ICF forms. In the US, we have HIPAA, and we know, that needs to be included. If you don't have that included, that's going to be a problem for your submissions. So that's part of the completeness that Larissa was talking about. Also, when we have our site networks, we know, generally speaking, in a lot of these sites, who can complete the startup activities simultaneously versus who can complete them sequentially.
Right.
Of course, if you can negotiate contracts and budgets when the IRB submission, I know that wasn't part of the question, but understanding the entirety of the timelines to get those sites ready to enroll, and knowing all of the activities. This is something that, having done, worked with other startups, other companies, we have that basis of knowledge that is going to be an asset to any startup company, knowing how can I get the first patient in as quickly as possible.
Very helpful. Thank you for that.
Just add,
yeah, of course,
Frederick,
Larissa, go ahead.
New guidelines have come in now on the diversity action plans. We need to have a patient population which is taking into consideration all the diverse population. So that's a new guideline, and the studies have to be designed. And this is something that a CRO can quickly help you to formulate and include in the protocol, as well as in the study design. So if such things are missed out, then there could be a chance that your protocol may be sent back with queries. So I would this is something that we should be very careful with the regular updates. As I said at the beginning, the changes happening at the regulatory level, which are rapidly taking place. So for everybody to keep in touch with what's required and how to really go about it, it's an important, like diversity action plan, which the FDA has asked for now, is very important piece. Pediatric investigational plan. Now, EU and FDA all want an PIP to be in place for any product which is not really having the pediatric population as part of the clinical trial. So these things can bite at the later stage, because you would have not planned for it and you don't have a document in place. So these kind of advice a CRO can definitely give in advance.
Very helpful. Thank you for that. I wanted to touch briefly as well on designing and conducting post-market data studies and develop real-world evidence. And this is something that for a lot of smaller companies in our field is a bit abstract and quite new, and none of them are typically on the market. And this is something that they might need to plan for in a few years from now. But maybe each of you could just share briefly some of the best practices in designing and conducting post-market trials and developing real-world evidence from the point of view of a much smaller company. I know this is an extremely broad topic, and we could do a whole separate webinar on this. But just very briefly for our cohort participants who may not be very familiar with post-market work. And maybe Larissa, I'll start with you.
In a very nutshell, I would say don't over-engineer post-marketing studies. They're simplistic in some ways, but they're also very complex. Try and pick up the statement, the problems. What is your objective? Try to focus on the objective and try and design studies which are obviously being run in a clinical setting where the amount of monitoring oversight maybe much less than what you see in, early phase clinical trials. So the advice would be try and make a study which is very simple, addresses your objective of what the regulatory authorities have asked you to, monitor, and make sure that the systems that you're applying are aligned to a very cost-effective solution. So when you're working with a CRO, please do ask them to deal with your late phase studies, or in a manner which is not putting all bells and whistles into running a study, but making it a more simplistic, straightforward study with the most economical platform for collection of data. The EDC has to be not very complex. So as you're building a cost for any study, as we talked earlier, there are different factors. So, your whole database, how it is managed, what is the EDC, what are the safety platforms that you're going to use. Those could be very expensive in early clinical phase trials, but they could be very cost effective and more tailored to those late phase studies. So I would say startups should be, trying to make it as simple as possible and work with CROs. Again, this is a very gray area. You could spend money and get nothing, and not go to just try to keep and select the right sites.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Thanks, Larissa. Lisa, your perspective on this. I guess you get involved in post-market trials as well, and
our involvement in post-market trials is much lower than we focus mainly on the early phase studies and the pivotal studies. So but I would agree with Larissa, focusing on the need, removing any extraneous things, that's important really at any phase of the studies, but really focusing on the need, looking at what the authorities have said you should be focusing on. Focus on that. It's not the time to add any extras. Look at what's needed and have it as concise as possible.
Makes sense. Now, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but there have been a number of changes in recent years in how clinical studies are conducted. We see virtual clinical studies and decentralized clinical trials, remote monitoring, AI-powered enrollment services, and so on. All of these concepts are relatively new to certainly a lot of startups in the MedTech industry. Can you provide some clarity on what are these all about? What does a small startup company need to know about some of these different initiatives? And Larissa, maybe I'll start with you.
So,
and how does it benefit them, I guess, ultimately is the question.
I mean, I may just address it because I'm in the commercial space.
Yeah.
I these days meet a lot of customers, which are startup, biotechs, mid-size, and my observation has been that many times the companies want to take a very safe route. They want to follow the old. It's always, as they say, there's a whole topic of change management around the world. It's like a PhD topic, everybody's. So there is obviously inertia. Everybody wants to just stay in a very safe place and want to follow the normal method. But my personal view is that the new regulations which are coming in are actually a big value add to the industry. It has been it's been actually, I feel very blessed that before I retire, I can see some very strong movements made in the industry. We took many, many years. I mean, I remember from being CRA to project director and to even head of a business unit, we were following very standard practices of ICA GCP. And then there was standard, there were no questions asked. Nobody used to ever challenge you on why you're doing what you're doing. And today we are becoming more intelligent. I would say we have become more smarter. If the site is not recruiting, there's no need to go for a monitoring visit just to sake of ticking a box, right? Now you can actually do a lot of work in-house and follow up with the sites. I love the new DCT platforms. I love the I'm going to meet many companies and I say, why don't you look at the in silico work? Because we have so much data and the companies have open data sources now. They are sharing their past clinical trial data. Why don't we use those as a standard and then run our study and see what the output and change is. The world has become so agile, and it might sound complex, but it is very cost effective. So especially for startups, if you have a strong hand to hold, a good CRO, it could be any CRO. You just have to have the right CRO in place. And you talk about these and say, look, I really want to go forward with this. They have already gone into the startup phase. They have already venturing into unknown territories. So why not take on some of the new guidelines and walk with them? There may not be many companies who've done end-to-end work in those new guidelines. We also, as a company, are constantly evolving, understanding, challenging, speaking to the regulators. So we are also, moving forward with that. But it's a very positive initiative. I think it's great. It'll save a lot of cost. It'll save time, and it will definitely be a more higher level of signals we'll get earlier on the product safety and efficacy. This is my personal belief, because these are very driven by data which has been collected over the years.
Very helpful, thank you. And Lisa, your perspective on this. Does Proxima typically get involved in decentralized trials as well? And
decentralized trials in the US is still growing. I am excited. I recently saw a post that the FDA just published guidelines on the conduct of decentralized clinical trials. So like Larissa was saying, it's evolving, it's growing. The acceptance of that practice is certainly here. It's here to stay, and implementing that it's going to be the way of the future, really, and the way the clinical trials are moving forward. It is a lot of flexibility that's offered. It's a cost-effective measure for the startup company. It's also appealing to the patients, so that's going to help the enrollment and the retention of the patients, which is going to make your timelines more successful. So there's really just a whole lot of wins in this. The downside is, like Larissa said, change is something that needs to be navigated very carefully. And it's not impossible, but it's very exciting. So having all of those things where everybody is moving in that direction is very, very promising. It's exciting.
Very, very helpful. Thank you for those insights. So I'm conscious of time. We have about 10 minutes left or so, and I wanted to touch on hospital pilots as well. And let me stay with Lisa on this. To what extent does Proxima get involved in hospital pilots at all, and how are they different typically from more traditional clinical trials? And what are some of the advice perhaps you would give to a smaller company looking to set up hospital pilots in the US?
There's a lot of the same principles that apply to hospital pilots, that apply on the pivotal trials. You're gonna want to select your hospital or hospitals very, very carefully, understanding what their skill set is, what their experience is, what their willingness to bring in a new device. They are going to have, a lot of the hospitals are going to have their infrastructure in place. Sometimes they might require local IRBs versus a central IRB, and you might want to go that way anyway for the cost effectiveness of a smaller study. And they have their own little idiosyncratic requirements that you're going to want to rely on a strong partner to understand and help you navigate that. The hospital setting is a vast area of resources as well. Looking at the larger hospitals that have a lot of experience focusing on the research studies is going to allow the trial to be successful. So some of the fundamental principles are still applicable here, where your site selection is going to be critical in this case, but kind of a little bit more political, a little bit more relationship based, especially when there are going to be, many fewer sites that you're relying on.
And thanks for that. And for a startup company that's based outside of the US, what might be the best way for them to approach a US hospital or healthcare institution to run a product hospital pilot? Should they approach them directly? Do they need to work through a CRO? What are some of the options there?
Some of the options are going to be kind of relying on KOLs relationships. We touched on that topic earlier, and there are pluses and there are minuses there.
Yeah.
Relying on KOLs that are working at very strong research facilities. We have a lot of strong research facilities that are associated with medical schools because the medical students are, learning the research, and those are very ripe for the picking for sites in pilots. They can be also identified with a CRO that has really good partnerships with some of those institutions. It's a very it's a very large industry, very tight network. So having those relationships, selecting a CRO that's got those strong relationships. I've reached out, I'm sure Larissa can speak to this as well, reaching out to prior partners because we've had those relationships. We know those team members, whether we've worked with them in a prior life, in a prior role, or currently as a company on another clinical trial and an indication. But really knowing those networks is going to be very helpful with selection.
That's great, and I do have one more question from a cohort that's more US related. So I'll just stay with Lisa here for a second. Where for a novel device in the US that may not have reimbursement mapped out, may not have its payment codes yet, are they still able to conduct clinical trials and are they still able to conduct hospital pilots, or is it a prerequisite to somehow have those payment CPT codes in place first?
It's definitely been done where those CPT codes are not in place. There does require a little bit of creativity in place when working with the sites in terms of budgets. Kind of discussing with the sites the feasibility of the clinical trial. We're in the industry of new and developing and up and coming, so it's certainly not impossible. It just requires a little bit of creativity, a little bit of an open mind. Bringing a bunch of different perspectives to the table and working around and coming to a good solution for that. It's certainly been done. I've personally worked with companies, small startup companies, where that was a need, and we talked through it. If we hit a roadblock, we course corrected and changed our plan and just got a little bit creative. So it's certainly helpful if there already is a CPT code. Not impossible. A little bit of additional dialogue.
Understood. Very, very helpful. And Larissa, for Asia Pacific, obviously very heterogeneous set of markets. But for those markets where there is reimbursement, does that affect how smaller companies can run their trials, whether it's pre-market or post-market trials? Are there some markets where they really should try to get their reimbursement sorted out first, or is there really no relationship or connection between reimbursement and obtaining reimbursement and running trials at later stages? You're on mute, Larissa.
Again, a disclaimer, I'm not an expert in reimbursement markets, but I know for sure what I'm seeing from the customers with whom I'm working. Australia is a big place. They do go there for the sake, because I think the process is more streamlined and it's more straightforward. I would say if you can have it's a bit tedious. What I've understood, it's not very easy to get into the list, but if you have the bandwidth and you have the intent, I think it would be obviously good to tap into markets like, for example, even Singapore, Taiwan, Korea, good markets to look at from reimbursement point of view. Very strict guidelines are there.
Yeah. No, that's helpful. We are getting almost to the top of the hour. I did want to ask Lisa one more question, and I don't want to put you on the spot. You may not have the answer to this because it may be more of a commercial question, but coming back to running pilot programs in the US, advice that startups are often given is that they should really enter into a hospital pilot where the ultimate outcome, assuming that it's positive, the results are positive, the pilot becomes a paid pilot, and the startup can start to get some revenue from actually providing product to that hospital. And it becomes sort of part of a commercial rollout, if you like. Is that something that you see? Do you have views on how that can be best managed?
I don't I haven't seen that very often. There's a lot of gray area with that. I don't really want to speak to that because that is beyond my area of expertise. But I am familiar from the site perspective that that's a little bit of a risk as well for the site. So it's something that any startup company would certainly want to go to somebody who has experience and can really guide them appropriately, for sure.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, and we have our commercial webinar coming up next week, so I think we might just repeat that question to our speakers then. Well, thank you both. I wanted to just as we wrap up, ask you, and I'll turn to Larissa first, maybe reflecting on what we've spoken about today. Any final tips or advice that you might have on the for the MedTech startup community and some of the scale-ups we're working with as they're planning their clinical trials?
Two words of advice. Very strong process for RFP management. Get an expert to make sure that the proposals that you're receiving are well understood, well vetted. That's the first point, because once you get into a contract with any CRO, make sure that you know what you're paying for. And that would be a very critical piece. That is one advice. And the second advice, I'm also learning as I move along. There are a lot of grants available around the world by different government bodies. And do try and tap into those grants. You would be surprised. There is a lot of incentives available. So for startup to get any additional funding from any of the governments would be a big value add. So do look at these two things in a big way.
Great advice. Thank you for that. So having someone vet your RFPs, and that probably makes sense given the size of those RFPs very often, and looking at grants for funding. The whole area of funding clinical trials was a topic that we didn't have a chance to get to today, but leveraging grants as far as possible certainly makes sense. Lisa, your final thoughts and tips or advice?
Tips. I'm gonna stick with two.
Sure.
Suit with Larissa. One is understand risks, not just to patients with the device, but risks to the whole clinical trials, all of them that you're going to need to run. Understand those risks, minimize those risks, and manage those. Continue to focus on those. Quality by design and risk management is a very, very important thing for the health of clinical trials. It's been quite a few years that the US FDA made that a requirement, and it's a very smart requirement. Follow that. The other piece that I would recommend is understand quality. Focus on quality, and when you select your partner, I'm not going to repeat what Larissa said, but when you select your proper partner, make sure that it's a quality focus. There's no sense in doing something that's not going to have a quality focus, because then your whole trial again is at risk. So understanding how those pieces tie together, how they live separately, and how you can focus on both of those is going to be really key to having your program be successful.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lisa and Larissa. Great having you both on the panel. Tremendous insights here. We could have spoken about this for much longer, but this is the time we have, I'm afraid. So thank you again, both, so very much for joining us. Stay on the line. We are going into closed door Q&A in just a moment. But at this point, I wanted to say thank you to our YouTube and LinkedIn audience who are watching us live streamed. Next week, our topic is commercialization, building distribution and sales networks. So please do stay tuned for that. Otherwise,